Welcome back everybody, I'm Nick930, and today I want to share with you my final thoughts on the highly anticipated next entry to the God of War series, God of War Ragnarök. God of War Ragnarök is a third-person action-adventure game, created by Santa Monica Studio and published by PlayStation. In it, players will once again assume the role of the Ghost of Sparta, Kratos, alongside his teenage son Atreus, as they travel across the 9 realms to prevent the cataclysmic event known as Ragnarök. The game sees a return of the well-received redesigns offered by 2018's God of War, with an increased emphasis on exploration, coupled with a new perspective on the series' iconic brutal combat systems. Though, unlike the popular 2018 game, Ragnarök offers a significantly larger scale overall, with bigger game worlds to explore, expanded combat systems, and a much more ambitious story that manages to deliver on all of its lofty promises. And after about 30 to 40 some hours playing through the game this past week, I can confidently say that God of War Ragnarök isn't just a masterpiece, it's also one of the very best games that I've played in the past decade. So let's first start by taking a spoiler-free look at the game's story. God of War Ragnarök kicks off about 3 years after the previous game, with Kratos and Atreus now forced to endure a brutal multi-year winter storm known as Fimbulwinter, the mythological precursor to a cataclysmic event called Ragnarök. Aware of this impending doomsday, the duo set out once more, this time to seek out the legendary Norse god of war Tyr, in hopes that together they can find a way to prevent the end of days. But along the way, they'll be forced to contend with the wrath of the Aesir gods, including the god of thunder Thor, Freya, mother of Baldur, and the All-Father himself, Odin. Meanwhile, Atreus is desperate to uncover more about his mysterious past, and is willing to do whatever it takes to find some answers, even if that means doing things his own way. And that's all I'm really willing to say about the core plot itself, as I'd like to avoid spoiling anything. But I will say that the story is exceedingly ambitious in what it attempts to deliver, and succeeds in doing so with some smart use of classical Norse mythological elements, combined with God of War's own unique spin on those tales. The lighthearted humor of the 2018 game also makes a bit of a comeback as well, which comes as some much needed relief to an otherwise very drama-heavy and intense narrative. All the favorites return here, including the disembodied, smartest head in the world, Mimir, the brash and ill-mannered dwarven blacksmith Brock, and his germophobic but brilliant brother Sindri. And all of these characters are given much more screen time than before, and will sometimes even accompany characters on story-specific quests, providing more opportunities to get to know these characters in ways that just weren't possible before. Alongside the returning cast are a slew of brand new characters to meet as well, including the giant Tyr, many of the various Aesir gods, and the mysterious Amber Goda, all of whom add something completely different to the ensemble, without ever feeling too dominant to the point of being distracting. Though Kratos and Atreus' relationship is of course the core of this rebooted God of War storyline, and Ragnarök follows through on that in a big way, making for a beautifully satisfying epic tale from start to finish. The only real concern I can offer in regards to the story is perhaps some uneven pacing in the middle, with some questlines feeling a bit stretched past their limit. But this is minor and is carried substantially by the fantastic gameplay systems and level designs. One of my few disappointments with the previous God of War game was that it sold us on this epic Norse world composed of multiple realms, all completely different from one another. But in reality, only the Midgard realm was fully utilized, while the handful of other available realms were reserved mainly for story-specific quests or optional combat challenges. God of War Ragnarök avoids this mistake, and beefs up its open world design considerably, with all 9 realms now being properly integrated throughout the story, many of which offer their own large open-ended environments in much of the same way that Midgard did. This includes returning realms like Midgard and Alfheim that have changed considerably due to the Fimbulwinter, along with brand new realms like the industrial dwarven lands of Svartalfheim and the dense jungle rivers of Vanaheim. Some of the realms are still reserved for more linear sequences interspersed throughout the story, but they do feel fully realized and contribute to a far greater, more varied adventure overall. There's even a new central hub area to hang out in, where players can rest and relax, and speak with their allies or gear up for their next journey. Unlike the previous God of War, realm travel has also been greatly simplified, and can now be achieved directly from the mystic gateways using special seeds. This helps to cut out the overly repetitive nature of the first game, where you were stuck running back and forth through Tyr's temple just to switch realms. But now, as long as you have the seed, you can run up to any gate and fast travel straight to another realm, which more or less eliminates a lot of the repetitive feel from before. Within those open-ended locations, there's a lot of familiar activities available to complete, including legendary chests with rare upgrades and armor pieces, rune chests that require you to do a bit of puzzle solving to unlock, and Odin's ravens that need to be destroyed with a well-aimed axe throw. But there's also a few new activities mixed in, like Draugr holes and Berserker gravestones, that offer some challenging boss fights that are all unique from one another. And these collectible poems that need to be found hidden throughout the 9 realms, each of which seems to pay tribute to a different legendary story. Alongside this, Ragnarok also offers some really good side quests to complete, referred to here as favors. These quests are so well done that they can easily be mistaken for a mainline campaign quest, with lots of additional dialogue between characters and massive set-piece moments that help contribute to the massive sense of scale overall. They're also completely optional, so if you don't want to spend that extra hour or two, you can easily just steer your boat the other direction and complete the main quest line instead. Then, there's also several additional labor challenges players can complete, which include things like crafting sets of armor, finding the many collectibles hidden throughout the game, and completing specific combat challenges like destroying a set number of enemy types or objects, all of which will reward the player with helpful XP boosts and other bonuses to enhance Kratos' combat effectiveness. Speaking of which, God of War Ragnarok also sees some subtle changes to the well-received combat design introduced back in 2018. The core concept remains the same, with players alternating between the slow but heavy Frost Axe and the classic flame-drenched Blades of Chaos, as they rip and tear apart groups of mythological enemies in spectacular fashion. The camera is once again situated behind Kratos, rather than being fixed like in the old games, providing a more intimate feel to the action, and all the core controls remain about the same too, with quick attacks, heavy attacks, blocks, shield breaks, parries, and evades all being tied to the same buttons. But combat itself feels much more properly integrated into the world now, with new environmental objects that Kratos can pick up and smash into enemies, and ledges that players can climb up, swing across, and drop down from using a powerful slam move. This verticality also applies to general environmental traversal as well, as there's now more of these semi-automated platforming sequences that see Kratos leap from ledge to ledge or dive through specially marked barriers to uncover a secret path. In addition to the base attacks, Ragnarok also sees the return of these special runic attacks too, which, after a brief cooldown, can be used to unleash more powerful weapon-specific attacks on enemies. These are some of the coolest looking attacks in the game, and an absolute necessity throughout the course of my playthrough, as they can deliver some much needed relief when being overwhelmed by larger groups of enemies or a powerful boss. And from what I can tell, each of the runic attacks felt good to use and visually distinct from one another. Special relics can also be equipped too, and can offer additional enhancements mid-battle like a temporary boost to melee damage, or even the ability to slow down enemies. If all else fails, players can unleash their Spartan Rage once the red meter is filled, enabling Kratos to launch into a fury of powerful attacks. Spartan Rage can also be swapped out for other powerful special attacks too, which further adds to the combat variety. Like before, Kratos is also accompanied by his son Atreus, who can be ordered to fire special arrows and summon spiritual creatures to aid in combat. Though now that he's a bit more grown up here, he's significantly more useful in the field, and can be seen performing a lot of more sophisticated attacks on enemies in the background. Atreus is also given some different arrow types this time around, including sonic arrows that can be used to stun enemies and break apart certain metals, and the sigil arrows that will apply hex effects to objects and enemies, which is useful for amplifying and propagating certain status effects like fire or ice. Players may even be accompanied by other characters on their journey, who will offer their own form of ranged attacks and special runic summons to mix things up. Now, before I discuss this next feature, I do want to note that this goes into a bit of spoiler territory, and while I typically avoid talking about it at all, I do feel it's important to discuss since it's a pretty major feature all throughout the game. Still, if you'd like to skip this section, I've added timestamps in the description so that you can skip past. Now, for those of you who are still here, one of Ragnarok's biggest new features is the ability to play as Atreus himself. Now, these sequences don't necessarily take up a bulk of the overall playtime. You'll still be ripping monsters apart with your bare hands as Kratos more often than not, but there's still enough of these Atreus sequences mixed in to warrant mentioning here, especially considering he comes with his own unique abilities and animation set. It's all done extremely well, and I think the character himself has grown both literally and from an emotional standpoint, making his sequences much more interesting than I anticipated. Some of his sequences can drag a little bit, which I hinted at before, but just playing around with all of his different combat moves and unlocking his own unique set of skills helps to keep these areas plenty interesting from a gameplay perspective. Another big improvement offered in Ragnarok is the updated enemy variety. While almost every enemy from the last game returns in at least some capacity, Ragnarok spends a great deal of time throwing completely new enemies at the player, each with a visually distinct appearance and combat set. You won't, for example, run into a bunch of the same troll with a different color shade this time around, but instead we'll face all kinds of weird mythological creatures like stalkers, grims, wretches, wights, and these weird rune-based wisps. Even in the later portion of the game, God of War Ragnarok is still tossing out totally unique enemy types at the player, which is a major step up from the often repetitive nature of the enemies in the last game. Bosses are another great area of improvement, as Ragnarok seems to harken back to the classic God of War days in regards to its scale. I don't want to necessarily spoil any of the bigger bosses that you'll face, but you should know by now that you'll face off against the God of Thunder himself, Thor, which in and of itself is an incredibly cool concept. And the execution of this fight is just as satisfying as it should be, with some great animation work, attack variety, and tight evade and block windows, which keeps the player feeling challenged without ever feeling overwhelmed. If combat ever gets to be too challenging, then it's probably time for an upgrade using the newly refined player progression system. A lot of the basics introduced before are still in place here, but Ragnarok also seems to put more emphasis on things like the weapon attachment, in this case the handle to the Leviathan axe, that can be used to fine-tune the weapon's profile to suit a specific playstyle. Armor crafting also returns and seems to function the same, though it does have all new designs to fit the updated themes, and instead of slotting enhancements into individual pieces of equipment like before, enhancements are instead slotted directly into an amulet that can hold a maximum of 9 once each slot has been unlocked. If 3 of the same enhancement type are applied to the amulet, then the player will also benefit from a bonus perk, only further adding to the variety of player gear customization. Meanwhile, the skill tree has been modified to feature 3 columns of upgrades per weapon and ally, allowing players to improve their technique effectiveness, their ranged attacks, and the variety of melee combat moves. Some of the moves from the past game need to be relearned again, as per typical God of War fashion, though many of the moves have been replaced with brand new ones that I feel were much more effective in combat and more useful to remember than before. There's also more incentive to use these moves now, as completing skill labors will unlock new mod token slots for that specific skill, allowing for further enhancements like extra damage, stun, or immolation perks. The whole progression system just feels like a much better realized version of what we had before. And while I still feel the UI for these menus are initially overwhelming to look at, they are still effective, and I found it was easy to find what I was looking for to tailor the progression to suit my own preferred style of play. Overall, when it comes to the gameplay, God of War Ragnarok delivers precisely what I was hoping it would accomplish. God of War 2018 was good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't quite living up to its predecessors. But this game provides the best of both worlds, culminating in one of the best gameplay experiences in the franchise's history. Finally, we have the game's presentation. Now, I've already spoken at length about the presentation a few days ago with my direct comparison, which I'll be sure to link below. But having played even more of the game since then, I have to say that the game only gets better looking as it goes along. The various other realms introduced later in the game showcase some absolutely gorgeous vistas, with rich color that really pops on an HDR OLED screen. Particle effects also become ridiculously abundant in late game battles, in a good way, as it seems like it's really flexing the chaotic nature of all these different weapons and magic elemental attacks clashing with each other. And being able to play it all using the variable refresh rate mode with a 4K resolution at 40 FPS made the experience feel buttery smooth from start to finish, with not even the slight hint of a performance dip, even in the most complex of sequences. As far as the visual and gameplay bugs go, I did run into a few very minor issues that already seem to have been addressed with the day 1 patch, including one in Svartalheim where a mission quest marker didn't properly update, and one weird instance where my ally refused to get back in the dog sled, locking me into place for about 30 seconds until they figured it out. There was also a character introduced later in the game whose sword strapped to their back would bounce around unnaturally, which was very distracting whenever that character was on screen. But that's about it. I never had the game crash, there wasn't any artifacting, there wasn't any major bugs. Even if something seemingly bad would happen, like a rare resource from a difficult enemy falling off a cliff, the game smartly sends that resource to a recovery chest at the nearest blacksmith, ensuring you'll always get that important loot. Overall, God of War Ragnarok is simply put a masterpiece. It's been a long while since I've had a game where I was excited to boot it up as soon as possible and continue playing through the main story just to see what would happen next. The story sets up an impossibly epic premise and confidently delivers on it, with a great cast of characters, fantastic voice acting performances, and top-notch animation work to go along with them. The gameplay is also the best the series has felt in years, building off of everything established previously and adding in bigger enemies, larger worlds, and more meaningful side content. Just playing through the game casually, completing a few side quests here and there, and trying to 100% one of the locations took me around 40 hours, and there's still so much more to do. And the difficulty on the balanced mode I chose to play on felt perfect, with each encounter offering enough of a challenge to stay engaging without ever feeling impossible or unfair. I think it's safe to say that God of War Ragnarok is not just the best game on the PlayStation 5 this year, but the best game on the PlayStation 5 period, and is well worth the price of admission. But what do you guys think? Are you going to be picking up God of War Ragnarok this week? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.